It was an excellent song to lead into this lesson this morning. In our discussion a couple of weeks ago about heaven, it was clear to me that we were not done with the topic even after almost an hour of discussing it. So this lesson this morning is for the purpose to present some more food for thought that we may consider in this evening's class. And I want to emphasize that. I would like you to come back this evening with questions, comments about this topic of heaven. It's obviously a topic in which we have, or certainly should have, or better have, great interest. After all, the place where we desire to spend eternity, it's only logical to want to know what we're aiming for, right? The Air Force says aim high, which makes you wonder what those pilots are doing. But that's our goal as Christians, isn't it? We're aiming high. We're aiming for eternity. We're aiming for heaven. So our text, as Glenn read for us, thank you, Glenn, for that reading, contains some interesting questions. First of all, because of who's asking the questions. The context is, as always, important. Our text for this morning comes near the end of Stephen's defensive speech, before the Sanhedrin Council. And in that speech, he has been laying out a very concise, if brief, history of Israel, much as Peter did in Acts 2. Only Stephen's speech is much more pointed, I guess we could say, as he is addressing the leaders of Israel and making accusation against them, thus demonstrating the historically poor leadership of the nation. Some of these accusations centered on leaders concentrating on the physical rather than the spiritual. And so we hear Stephen decrying this aspect of the physical rather than spiritual and forcing their focus on the spirit nature of God. So when we ask the question, what size sandal does God wear? We look at the passage here and what Stephen had to say to the council. He says, our fathers had the tabernacle of testimony in the wilderness, just as he who spoke to Moses directed him to make it according to the pattern which he had seen. Our fathers, in turn, received it. They also brought it in with Joshua upon dispossessing the nations that God drove out from our fathers until the time of David. David found favor in God's sight and asked that he might find a dwelling place for the house of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him, a house for God. Moreover, the Most High does not dwell in houses made by human hands. He just said that a house was built for God, and now he's saying that God doesn't dwell in a house made by human hands. As the prophet says, heaven is my throne, and the earth is the footstool of my feet. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what place is there for my rest? Was it not my hand that made all these things? Now, Stephen brings it down to this. God has done everything to be close to us, including a temporary dwelling place nearby for us all to feel his presence. But God is greater than all that. The questions he asks are taken from Isaiah 66 and very possibly well known to his hearers. Those questions emphasize the spiritual nature of God and of his majesty, of his grandeur, of his authority, while at the same time diminishing those same aspects of the council. Stephen said, "The Most High does not dwell in places made by hands," and then quotes the three questions. What kind of house will you build? What place for his footstool? And did God not make it all? While these queries certainly fall into the rhetorical arena, they are not at all facetious, and they serve well to make Stephen's point. There are striking similarities in these questions to the answers given to Job in chapters 38 to 41. For instance, in chapter 40 at verse 2, God asked, "Will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer." Who's going to reprove God? In chapter 38, verses 4 through 7, God says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding, who set its measurements, since you know? Or whose measuring line over it? Or on what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." These questions God's asking, and all questions have answers only known to God. It's kind of interesting, this passage where he says the morning stars sang together. Scientists used to make fun of that passage until they were actually able to listen to the sound the stars make. And they found out that indeed the stars do sing. But with these answers known only to God, why is that the case? And it's simply because God is a spirit. John 4, verse 24. And as a spirit was at creation, is the creator, the designer, the master of all. And therefore, he has personal, intimate knowledge of the reasoning, the construction, the function, the interrelational quality of all things, especially his creation in his own image, mankind. We understand that here is the separation between us and him. God, being all spirit, has as a single characteristic, and as such is not limited as we are, who are twofold beings. God the Spirit is governed by that aspect of him. We, though we are twofold, physical and spiritual, should be governed by that same spiritual aspect, the same spiritual characteristic. But we need only to look at the world around us to know that this simply is not the case. God, as spirit, has a spiritual home. We mortals, being temporal, have a temporal home. We understand this about our world to one degree or another. We have little or no concept of the spiritual home where God dwells. When my parents would sit with me for late hours of the night, trying to explain multiplication tables to me, it would go something like this. If you have a box of 8 apples and you get 7 more boxes of apples, how many apples would you have? And my response would be something along the lines of, can I have an apple to eat? And why was that the case? Because my mind just didn't literally compute. And so it is when God tells us about himself and about his home, just as I didn't, we have no frame of reference. Consider this aspect. We are told God so loved the world that he gave his only son that no one should perish. Let me ask you a question. How many of you would give up the life of one of your children to die for someone else? Especially if you had prior knowledge that almost everyone you were doing that for would reject the offer. If you knew beyond any doubt that a majority would feel no or little appreciation for your effort. What if some even refused to believe you even made the gesture? Should we venture into history, we readily see how God demonstrated time and again how he loved his people and verily his creation in his efforts to protect and care for them despite their multiple rejections. Yes, he did punish his people, but he did so with the intent to bring them back into his fold. And then finally, in a final effort to convince, he gave his son. This expression of godly love has stretched from creation to this present day. In Isaiah 55, beginning in verse 6, Isaiah said, "Call upon him when he is near. Let the wicked abandon his way, and the unrighteous person his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, and he will have compassion on him. And to our God, for he will abundantly pardon." And then God, through Isaiah, says this, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." This is a very succinct expression of God's nature in both planning and action. It is not like ours. We, as physical, have not thoughts or ways like him. So how did we arrive at this image of an old man abiding in the clouds, white hair, pure white robes, wizened old man? Well, a number of verses give images of God, and we'll look at some. But understand that God, in these passages, is sitting up late with us, studying the times tables. We're still looking at this comparison of God God's ways, God's thoughts, as opposed to ours. And I suppose one way of looking at that would be that if you have two people approaching a problem, and one has full knowledge of all the resources available to him, and the other knows he only has himself, which one is going to approach the problem with better knowledge? Which one is going to approach the problem with a fuller appreciation of how it might be dealt with? We are the ones with the limited knowledge. God is the one with all the resources. So, Daniel 7, beginning in verse 7. I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames, and its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were serving him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court convened, and the books were opened. Well, there we have it, right? This is the image most often presented. God, white hair, white robes, flaming throne, court convened, books of names opened. And that's always the picture we see, right? In all the cartoons and everything. We see a fellow sitting at a big desk and a great big book is open. And he looks at the guy that's looking down like this and he says, you had a great life, but you were always looking at your phone. That's the image we have. Exodus chapter 34, beginning at verse 5. The Lord descended into the cloud and stood there with him as he called upon the name of the Lord. And again with the clouds. Exodus 15, verse 11. Who is like you among the gods, Lord? Who is like you? You're majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders. Okay, now from this passage, we have the concept of majestic, of holiness, awesomeness, working wonders. 1 Timothy 1, verse 17. Now to the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God, be glory and honor forever. Well, wait a minute. We just finished reading that he was white-haired, wearing a white robe, sitting on his throne. Now we read that he's invisible. Okay, I'm lost. How can you be both? You know, does he look like Schwarzenegger or does he look like Casper the Ghost? Which is it? What we have here are physical images that cannot be physical. 2 Samuel 22, beginning at verse 31. As for God, his way is blameless. You know, right there, we're not talking about any people, right? The word of the Lord is refined. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. For who is God except the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? God is my strong fortress. So we read that God is blameless. He's refined, or some versions might say perfected. He's our shield. He's our rock. He's our deliverer. Psalm chapter 103 at verse 19. The Lord has established his throne in the heavens, and his sovereignty rules over all. So we have a heavenly throne and a ruler over all. But how is a throne going to sit in the heavens? Wouldn't it seem it would fall crashing to the earth? So again, we have these examples, physical images that cannot be physical. Revelation 4, beginning at verse 1. John writes and says, "After these things I looked, and behold, a door opened in heaven. And the first voice which I had heard like a trumpet speaking to me said, 'Come up here, and I'll show you what must take place after these things.' Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was standing in heaven, and one sitting on the throne. And he who was sitting was like a jasper stone and sardius in appearance. And there was a rainbow around the throne, like an emerald in appearance. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and upon the thrones 24 elders sitting, clothed in white garments and golden crowns on their heads. Out from the throne come flashes of lightning, and sounds and peals of thunder. And 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne, there was something like a sea of glass, like crystal. And in the center and around the throne, 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. So now in this passage, we have an open door. We have a voice like a trumpet. We have a throne. There's one seated there on the throne. His appearance has changed. He's not looking like white robe and woolly white hair anymore. Now he's looking like jasper and sardius. Sardius is probably ruby. So he's looking like rock, like stones, like gemstones now. We see an emerald rainbow. We see lightning. We hear thunder. We see lamps of fire, robes, and crowns. Wow, what a description. What's it mean? Is it real? Is it physical? It can't be. One last one. Revelation chapter 20, verse 11. Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and the small, standing before the throne, and books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged according to their deeds. So what's the term great and small? Well, it just means that we'll all be there, folks. No matter what you think of yourself or what somebody else thinks of you, we're all going to be there. And in this view, again, we have the white throne. We have he who sat upon it. We see all physical aspects of what we are familiar with, heaven and earth, have fled, as there was no allowance for the physical in his presence. And then we have the judgment scene, both the ordinary and the elevated. Books of records opened for examination. Judgment upon each according to lives lived. And such a wide range in description, and yet all of these descriptions have common bonds. All speak to majesty, to authority, to invincibility, to refuge, to protector, savior, and so on. But does it trouble any that the pictures we get are all physical attributes? Well, it shouldn't bother, as God is giving us a physical image of a spiritual existence, spiritual being. What does a spirit look like? We were talking about this the other day, and talking about the gates of heaven are made up of us, each with a single pearl. What does that tell us? Either somewhere out there, there's a really big clan that makes some really big pearls, or souls are just very tiny, and the doors, the gates to heaven are very, very small. It's facetious to consider. So, in all of these descriptions of God, we have folks who try to take the passages and make something out of them that simply is not there. When we study the words that God has given for our benefit, we understand that context is of utmost importance. In harmony with this concept of context is the fact that God is constant and consistent. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 33, God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. Therefore, when we study his word as it is given, we must maintain not just the context of the passage, but context of the Bible in its entirety. God is a spirit. Therefore, we must worship him in spirit and truth always. God does not describe a real physical self. This point was made by Paul, I believe, when he talks about people who would carve something and use it, set it up as something they would worship, something they made. When I was in junior high school, I took wood shop. And we had to make a set of salt and pepper shakers. And the way we were going to do this, we took a little piece of birch, nice, or just pine, I guess it was. School wouldn't spring for birch. And it was a white colored wood. And we were supposed to take a piece of that and cut 2 half circles in it and then cut it in half. And then take darker pieces of wood and glue on either side. And that left a cavity for the salt and the pepper. And then we were supposed to cut around those 2 cavities and make half moon salt and pepper shakers. Can you guess how many times it took me before I actually got a set of salt and pepper shakers? 4 times. 4 times before I actually got it. Yes, so we have to deal with what God tells us, understanding that he is speaking to our limitations. And so it is with his home, heaven. The images we have of God ruling from a flaming white throne among clouds is simply that, an image we may relate to as we understand the examples. The holy city in Revelation cannot be a solid physical location because, verse 8, however, the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands. As the prophet says, heaven is my throne, and the earth is the footstool of my feet. What kind of house will you build for me? Says the Lord. Or what place is there for my rest? Was it not my hand that made all these things? How big is God's sandal? So how big do you need to make his footstool? He says here the earth is his footstool. I'm always impressed when I see these guys that wear shoe size 14 and bigger. And I'm always thankful that I don't have to buy their shoes. When God says something like, the earth is the footstool of my feet. Well, I'm really not aware of anybody who's been up in space and orbited the planet, anybody taking any pictures of some big feet resting on any spot on the earth. So this isn't talking about something physical. It's giving us a picture of something greater, much greater than ourselves. God is always described in superlatives. The reason for that is simply because God is superlative. What all of these images and descriptions tells us is simply this: whatever heaven is and whatever God is like, it is so much better than the very best this world has to offer. Why? Because this world can only offer the temporal, which is that which ages and dulls and eventually fades and dies. Is there joy in this life? Absolutely, of course. But every life ends the same. God in his heaven has given his pledge to care for those faithful to him. And he has prepared a place of refuge, one that precludes all of this life's pain and sorrow to be replaced by joy inexpressible. No tears, living in the light of Jesus, comforted by his Spirit. It is with him we want to dwell, with the God of eternity for eternity. When we start to try and make things that God offers us in his word into something that we want it to be, we are altering what God has told us. When my kids were little, I could tell them almost anything. And simply because I told them, they would believe it. Sometimes I would do things and they would believe it. Sometimes I would do and say things that they just felt was me. We were coming back from Tennessee on one trip, and we stopped in Hope, Arkansas, and went into a Waffle House for breakfast. And there were two good old boys sitting on the booth behind our kids, and they were nearly unintelligible. Their accents were so heavy and so thick. And my kids were sitting there about to laugh and trying very hard not to. Finally, those two fellas left. And my kids looked at me, and I said, "What is wrong with you?" They said, "We didn't know people really talk like that. We thought it was just you." Well, that's kind of like how we act with God. We want to make him into something that's entertaining or nice for us. And really what he is all that is good for us. So, do you want to spend eternity with God? Is it your desire? Is it the thing you want most? more than any aspect of this world? That's what I want. And I want it for you too. And I would hope that in our efforts to attain heaven, we help one another in that endeavor so that we don't go alone. Whatever might be your condition or situation, let's help one another get to heaven. As I've said before, it's not that life is so short, it's that eternity is so long. Whatever might be your condition, let us know so that we might assist as we stand.